Janine, are you happy for me to go? I don't do anything without Janine saying yes. That's good. Welcome everybody to the University of Sydney and welcome to another United States Studies Centre event for 2025. Can you believe it's already mid-February? We've had 1 month of Trump only. So I hope you're all keeping your stamina going, you're eating all your veggies and everything, drinking plenty of coffee to keep up with the whole debate. Before we get started, I do like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and I like to connect it to the event that you've come to see so that it's not just a superfluous addition. So tonight the event is US-China competition, AI, chips, and export controls, where to next? So how do I connect that with Indigenous Australians? Well, they were this nation's first traders, and that also means they were this nation's first exporters. From trading goods with Macassan seafarers in Indonesia for generations, they're now exporting native botanicals, art, design, cyber, and clean energy solutions to world markets. So that's thousands of years of continuous history. What about history-making issues today? I think we see history made every day, actually, under a Trump administration 2.0. And a big part of that is technology competition. Before I talk more about technology competition, I'm going to introduce myself and the two speakers tonight. I'm Hayley Channer. I run the Economic Security Program at the US Studies Centre. Economic security is all about the intersection of the private sector and government. So think of an issue that requires the private sector to solve, that government intervention can't solve for itself. That's exactly where my program works at the intersection of. So, for example, in this case, tonight we're going to be talking about export controls, investment screening, and technology competition. And that's a major element of economic security in the world today. So to my two speakers, to unpack tonight's questions, we've got Mr. Kevin J. Wolf. Kevin is a partner at Akin Gump and a former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration with the US Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS. He did this role under the first and second Obama administrations from 2010 to 2017, and he has more than 30 years experience advising on export controls, sanctions, and other international trade issues. In particular, there's two areas where he is an undisputed expert. One is the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, what we call ITAR, and the other is US Export Administration Regulation, EAR. Kevin is out here in Australia. It's not his first trip. He's been here many times before, but he's supported by the US State Department, which pays for expert Americans to help come to Australia as emerging technology fellows to help Australians understand where is the US headed on technology controls and technology competition. So Kevin's worked for the last 30 years on this issue. He has amazing expertise. Our other speaker is Dr. Alan Dupont AO. Alan is the founder and CEO of geopolitical risk consultancy, Cognoscenti Group. He is also a defence and national security advocate for the Northern Territory government. He's one of Australia's best-known strategists, and he has an international reputation on geopolitical risk, defence and national security, and he's worked at the interface of security, politics, business, and technology, not just for government, but for the private sector and academia. Basically, Alan is the unicorn of what I would say my program looks for. Somebody who can work at cross-cutting issues, because you can't solve one problem without thinking about 6 other different problems that are all interrelated. So what have you all come to see tonight? You've come to hear from experts about US-China competition, specifically in technology issues like AI, chips, and also on export controls. Now, we've seen governments around the world intensify their competition in this area. They're trying to keep a tighter grip on things like semiconductor chips, artificial intelligence models. We've all heard about how China was able to recreate ChatGPT through DeepSeek. And we're also wanting to talk about some of the investment that underpins AI models. There's a couple of questions that are shaping the discussion tonight. The first one is, what impact will the new Trump administration have on US-China technology competition? Are the controls around semiconductor chips and AI models a sustainable effort? As the technology evolves, are we actually going to be able to keep control of it? And how can governments coordinate their different export controls, investment screening, and other regulations? So basically, tonight is about this brave new world where we have lots of technology moving very quickly. We've got lots of tech oligarchs surrounding Trump and people from Silicon Valley trying to create the new innovations. How is the US going to try and control these? And how is US-China competition going to evolve over the next 4 years? So with that, what I wanted to do is actually give the first question to Alan. Alan, could you please give us sort of a big picture understanding of the trajectory of US-China competition in the tech space, but, you know, interpret what's just happened over the last month and the Trump administration for it?
Well, okay, thanks very much and good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I spent 6 wonderful years at Sydney University quite a long time ago, so I'm quite familiar with most of the buildings. Not this one. It wasn't here when I was here.
This is a fancy one.
Yes, so all right, look, I know some of you will be tech experts, some of you won't be. So let me just make some broad framing comments. So I guess the first point I'd make is that the tech competition between the US and China is going to be one of the defining competitions of the next 20 or 30 years. Why is that? Because if you can dominate the world of high technology, you can dominate the future economy. And if you dominate the future economy, you're going to be number one in the world. And we have 2 countries that actually want to be number one. We all know, we talk about Trump wanting to make the United States great again, but Xi Jinping wants to make China great again. So there's an old Chinese proverb which says that 2 tigers can't live on the same mountain together, which the Chinese are very familiar with. And so that's really the broad strategic sort of setting, if you like, for the tech competition that we've seen develop over probably the last decade and a half. So a couple of other broad points I'd make about this. So why is the United States so concerned about technology developments in China? If you go back, say, 30 years, China was a technological backwater. And somehow out of the blue, a lot of you pick up the papers and you now find that China is leading in so many technologies. And those of you, if you've been reading the papers the last few weeks, DeepSeek and artificial intelligence. So this is a Chinese startup that seems to have miraculously been able to do for $5.5 million what ChatGPT paid $1 billion to develop a large language model that was more efficient and better. Okay, so that's the headline. Now, whether that's true or not, we can talk about later on. I don't actually think it is. But the point I'm making is that China has really closed the gap on the United States dramatically over the last 20 to 30 years, because it's been able to mobilize in the way that only an authoritarian state can, capital and state power to achieve strategic goals. And back in the early noughties, the Chinese looked at the United States and they thought, if we want to compete with the US, we have to be a technology power and a manufacturing power. So it's not just the leading edge technology, but you've actually got to translate that into manufacturing capability. You've got to make things from it, okay, that people want to buy and that economies need. And so the Chinese have steadily and assiduously closed the gap on the United States quite dramatically. Now, if you're sitting in Washington and you're watching this, suddenly you wake up one morning and you suddenly realize that the Chinese are peer competitors in so many of the leading edge technologies. And what really brought this home to policymakers in the United States was a very bland document put out by the Chinese government called Made in China 2025. This came out in about 2015. And what it was a blueprint for Chinese domination of all the technology sectors that they thought would be critical to the future economy. Quantum technology, AI, new materials, robotics, all these things that we now talk about. But 10 years ago, people were only vaguely aware of a lot of this. And there it was, a blueprint. And when US policymakers looked at that, they thought, if China's successful in doing that, we aren't going to be number one anymore. And this actually could be an existential threat to the United States, because a lot of this technology is dual purpose technology that can have military application. So if China's military has this technology, it's going to actually be more powerful than the United States in the longer term if we don't compete. So what are we going to do about it? And what basically happened was the US decided to start to use its own levers of power, including export controls, which we'll unpack a little bit later, but that's one of a number of instruments that the US could use because it still remained the most important financial power, so it had money to deploy. It still was leading a lot of areas of technology, and it still dominated large parts of the ecosystems that were important for the future. So it's not like it was a lay-down misère for China. All right, so that sort of brings us up to the present. Now, if I just one final point. So export controls in the United States, this sounds like just a technical lever. That's just one part of the puzzle. So that's the Americans decided we got to play offense and defense if we're going to compete with China. So what do we got in our defensive toolbox? Well, there's things called export controls. That means we can actually restrict China from getting hold of the crown jewels of the US technology. But what are the things specifically we need to think about? How are we going to do that in practice? Now, so that's the way I would be framing our discussion about export controls. But there's another dimension to this too. And this is, okay, the US now can no longer dominate everything the way it did at the end of the Second World War. So it needs friends and allies. And so there's been an emerging group of countries, so-called trusted countries, I should say, that were working with the US on a range of technologies where they're pooling their resources. And there's this thing called AUKUS, which is an arrangement between the United States, Britain, and Australia, initially to build nuclear-powered submarines. But Pillar 2 of that agreement is all about technology collaboration. So that's the way I'd be framing this. And then I think that's a segue into...
And AUKUS opens the door for that technology collaboration and all these trusted partners. But at the same time, the US is trying to keep control of that technology and not allow any technology leakage. We're very lucky at the US Studies Centre. We just had Alan and Kevin for a private roundtable. And one of the things that we talked about was the history of export controls, where they came from and where they've come to. And one of the big points was about, well, you know, in the past, it used to be just nuclear weapons and missiles that were controlled and you know, really lethal technology. But now, to Alan's point, you know, AI and other emerging technologies can be used for both commercial or military uses. So, Kevin, I wanted to turn to you. You know, you've done this for 30 years. I felt like we needed counselling, actually, after our private roundtable about what's happening now. But can you help explain for the audience what's happened in the last few years? Maybe like, I mean, you were there under Obama, but what's changed under Biden and Trump 2.0 about technology controls? What's making them more complicated now than back in the past when it was nuclear weapons, missiles, and other really sensitive, lethal things?
Right. That was a great summary. So since the end of the Cold War, the objective of export controls by the US, Australia, and other allies, as was said, is to regulate the items that are necessary to produce or develop or use conventional weapons or weapons of mass destruction. So that was a common, easily understood national security objective. And about the time, at the end of my time in government, when the Made in China 2025 policy was announced, we were realizing that that wouldn't be sufficient to deal with the Chinese national security threat that involved emerging technologies that were necessary to modernize China's military, but weren't directly related to doing so. And so in the very last month of the Obama administration, we wrote this very lengthy paper that didn't even refer to export controls as a way to address it, but only to run faster, for more industrial subsidies, to stay ahead of China economically, because export controls were limited in a more traditional national security mindset and weren't seen as a tool for economic competition. And what changed was a very public debate in 2017 and 18, completely bipartisan, where it was believed that export controls needed to start being used more broadly to address the threat that is China with respect to emerging technologies. But the Trump administration never really settled on a final answer as to what that meant. They just sort of swirled around with lots of different ideas and questions. It didn't actually do anything. And the Biden administration didn't either during its first year. But what happened in 2022 is that first with the Allied response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it was Russia invading Ukraine, not the other way around, just to be perfectly clear, was that allies, including Australia, 38 countries came together and used export controls to regulate the flow of items that Russia's industrial base needed to continue functioning. So the mold was broken about thinking about export controls as a broader strategic tool. And then intellectually, the real shift happened when the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, identified another national security objective of export controls, which was to stop all of the inputs, whether US or foreign, whatever they are, into the indigenous development in China, or that would in any way support the indigenous development in China of 4 technologies: advanced node semiconductors, logic, NAND, and DRAM, the compute power that goes into artificial intelligence, which are the NVIDIA GPUs that you've heard about, supercomputers, and then the semiconductor production equipment needed to make it. So what the National Security Advisor said, which became the first really novel export control regulations in late October 2022, was to say these are the force multiplying technologies. These 4 technologies are the things that everything else is built on. And the country that has the lead in these capabilities will dominate economically and will be able to create what is needed for their militaries to outcompete all other militaries. And so we, the US, need to maintain as large of a lead as possible, as you put it, over China in these 4 enabling technologies. And pretty much everything that's happened in the last 2 years has really been about strengthening that set of controls and that mindset, both on items sent from the US and through really novel extraterritorial applications of US law to apply to foreign origin items, non-US origin items outside the United States to implement them. And that's the setup, sort of what's happened with under the Biden administration. You want me to wait to go into the Trump administration to how it's going to go, or you want to send another question? You will bear the lead. So there was that fundamental shift, and there's a whole day's worth of sessions on the details behind how those novel controls were implemented. That's what I do for a living. The other thing that happened the last few days of the Biden administration on January 15th, in addition to containing China and stopping its ability to produce those 4 technologies, a rule referred to as the AI diffusion rule was published, which basically asserts jurisdiction globally over every modern integrated circuit on the planet and imposes US government licensing requirements on every transaction between anybody, anywhere, everywhere, all the time, always, for any reason, including within Australia. Basically taking the position that AI applications are as sensitive as nuclear weapons. They have the opportunity for the force of good, the opportunity for the force of evil, and just like nuclear weapons, they should be regulated aggressively and strictly. And so in order to create an AI algorithm, you need 4 things. You need the chips, the graphics processing units, in order to be able to, well, process the large amounts of data. And the second thing is data. You need the algorithms in order to make it all work together so that you can create an output, which is your ChatGPT or any other function that AI does. And then 4th, you need the smart people in order to be able to put it all together. The way, if you believe that AI is as much of a threat to the planet and US economic security and national security objectives, but one of those 4 things that you can regulate is the hardware. And the reason the hardware, the chips, can be regulated is that virtually 100% of what is at issue was designed by one company, NVIDIA, and almost 100% is produced by one company, TSMC, which is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company uses US equipment to do so. So what the US has done is to say, we are going to use that choke point jurisdictional reach over all that technology and all those chips and basically regulate the entire planet. And that's where we are now.
So Kevin, very quick follow-up to clarify things. So when this audience leaves, can you just explain so they can remember, because I also want to remember, like we talked about the sort of top 5 technologies that the Biden administration was trying to control,
Right.
and then juxtapose that with Trump administration.
Yeah. So the top 4 technologies, and there's a 5th called biotech. Remember, it's to stop China's ability to make advanced node semiconductors, stop China's ability to make the semiconductor manufacturing equipment that are needed to make the semiconductors, to stop China's ability to make artificial intelligence models that are in any way significant, and then to stop China's ability to produce supercomputers or quantum computers. So those are the 4, the last one I put as last one. The 5th is biotech, which was addressed briefly, but the Biden team never finished. And in terms of what the Trump administration is going to do, the honest to goodness answer is nobody has any idea. And the reason for that is that Trump personally doesn't care about anything that I just said.
Yeah.
He cares about tariffs. He sees the world in terms of deficits and sees which countries are taking advantage of the U.S., sees the world in sort of a zero-sum approach, and that other countries take us for suckers. And he's got one tool, which is imposing tariffs in order to force capitulation and leverage on policy issues. And what he cares about personally is large success, large deals, being able to work something out, showing that he won, and he's completely transactional. He'll trade anything away for anything in order to be able to look like he's doing something.
It was funny when he had that big press conference about AI to announce $500 billion more for AI. I assumed that was US government money because Trump was there, but actually it was all the companies.
Exactly.
So the visuals and the symbolism that you talk about, it's worked. It's worked on me.
Yeah.
Alan, I wanted to dive a bit deeper in that concept that you raised about offensive and defensive technologies. And you also raised DeepSeek, the issue of DeepSeek and one Chinese company being able to do things at a much reduced cost to, very expensive American innovation. When we were talking earlier privately, we talked about offense is the export controls. Defense. Defense is the export controls and offense is like the innovation. You work with businesses, you understand more the innovation side. Do you think that the US could be too focused on things like chips and actually there should be a broader awareness? I mean, what's the Australian context for this as well? I mean, there's a lot in there, but.
Okay, so let me start off by just expanding a little bit on the defense and offense. No, I'll say one other thing first. We're only talking so far about the United States. But let me just say something about China. So there are 2 teams in this competition. You think about this as the part of the great game. The 2 big teams on the board, the blue team, we'll call them the blue team. You're okay about that? So the blue team is the United States, the red team is China. So we're focusing on what Trump is doing or not doing at the moment, but let's just think about China for one moment. So because this goes back to the point that while the US is trying to work out its strategy to prevent China from becoming the dominant tech power in the future, the Chinese are also doing things because they don't want to be reliant on the United States. So they're going down the path of what I call technology autarky, which is we don't want to be dependent on the West because they might cut us off, right? Look what Mr. Trump's doing and what Biden did. So we're going to wean ourselves off our reliance on Western technology, mainly US technology, and we're going to start producing everything ourselves. And because we're a big country and there's 1.4 billion of us, we can pretty much produce everything and we can mobilize our capital to do that. So we may not have the leading edge chips, but we've got pretty good chips and we're going to get there. If it takes a little bit longer, that's what we're going to do. All right, so both teams are playing offense and defense. Right, so we talked about the defense side. Let's just go for the offense. What does that mean? So from an American point of view, the offense is it's about innovating, allowing the animal spirits of American entrepreneurs loose with minimal regulatory restrictions to do what they are really good at. Okay, and that means the US private sector. Now, the Biden administration, I hope this is not being unfair, wanted to have strong regulations around a lot of these technologies, particularly AI, because they believe that the government should be controlling this process, particularly AI because it was seen as a technology that had a lot of downside as well as upside, shall we say. Trump, I think, will loosen those regulations to a large extent, and we're going to see a lot of money going into these key technologies, and not only American money, but foreign money. That's the whole point. Trump wants to be a magnet for as much money and capital from overseas as well as in the United States to actually make US great again. And that means being the number one in technology. Okay, so, and the final point I just make here is this also plays into the debates about decoupling, which probably, most of you have heard about over the last 10 or 15 years. So way back in, say, 2015, when the US is thinking, right, how are we going to respond to China? So the predominant view in the United States was that China had actually stolen a lot of the technology. I mean, we can argue whether they did or didn't, but this was a dominant view in the US that the Chinese had got there because they had distorted the trade playing field in their favour by massive state subsidies. They've stolen a lot of IP, or they've actually coerced it from US companies, and there's a whole series of things. So therefore, we have to stop that happening. And maybe we need to start thinking about decoupling from the Chinese economy. Why is Wall Street in there giving away all its its secrets, et cetera, putting money into China? We need to reshore a lot of these things back to the US. And of course, Trump got onto this in the election and said, yeah, everything's got to come back and be made in the United States. So that was his reaction. So decoupling comes into this. So my view was about 10 years ago, I thought that would be, if you're thinking about this as a marriage that's gone bad, you might, since I'm a guy, I would say I might be separate from my wife, but we might agree to live together in the same house, right? The same roof. So that's a kind of separation of some kinds. But maybe that's not going to work. So my wife moves out. So we've decoupled, right? We've separated, but we haven't divorced because that's pretty extreme and there's a lot of money on the table. So we're not going to go down the divorce route. And so if you look at the US-China as about, then you think, so I thought 10 years ago, divorce would be most unlikely because they're so joined at the hip. Both are going to take a hit, so it doesn't make sense to divorce. So then the issue would be, well, maybe decoupling, how serious will be decoupling? And I thought it would be a light decoupling, but particularly in the tech sector. But I've now come to believe that decoupling is going to be much worse than I thought. I still don't think we're going down the divorce route, okay? I hope we're not, because that would be pretty catastrophic, I think. But it is going to be a much bigger decoupling. And it's not just about what the US is doing, because China has decided to decouple too, right? So you've got two things going on here. Righto. So this is all highly relevant to this discussion about where is this technology competition going, and what is it now? So the last thing is, what does it mean for Australia? So, right, I'm just going to pick the eyes out of this. So Australia is a technology taker by and large. We have a few pockets of excellence, quantum, technology, for example, but by and large, we are a technology taker, but we're primarily a US technology taker, right? Because of our alliance and our shared values and interests over a long period of time, it made sense for us to go with the US. And when the US was the leading technology power, it was pretty straightforward. You didn't have too much choice. But now China is giving countries choices because what they're doing is capturing whole ecosystems. If you think about EVs, well, we read about that in the paper, and China dominates the EV sector. Everything, batteries, rare earths, processing. So China wants to capture whole ecosystems. Why does it want to do that? It wants to do that because it wants to be the writer of rules. It doesn't want to be a rules taker from the US and the West. It wants to write the rules. And in order to write the rules, you've got to control the ecosystem, right? So that's where China is going. It's quite a clever strategy, and it's a very long-term strategy. So when we're talking about export controls and the role they play, you've got to think about the bigger picture here, and how the Chinese are thinking about protecting their interests. They know they're in a competition with the US, so does the US. So, we're not, people might be polite in polite conversation, but it's really a tech war going on here, but it's bigger than a tech war, because whoever wins this one is going to probably be the dominant state of this century, right? That's the way I look at it. So there's just a few comments. Sorry, I was going to get to Australia. Can I just say a few things okay. So, all right. So the key things for us are, I would say, some people may not agree with this, but I think that our policymakers are invested in the US winning the technology war. Not because we don't think Chinese technology isn't as good, but because if you take Chinese technology, you take on Chinese rules. And you take on Chinese rules, then you're basically on the Chinese team, and there are consequences. There's an upside to that, but there's also a downside, right? So everyone will have different views about that, but I can tell you the policymakers in government in Australia, it's not a Labor or coalition thing. I think there's pretty much alignment on this. We are on the US team. We've committed ourselves. So we want the US to win this technology competition, but there's not much we can do about it except in collaboration. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Because we do have niche capabilities here, and we have some very good scientists, we can make a contribution if we're allowed to do so. And this comes back to the US. Now, if we're allowed to do so means that the US has to make it easy for Australia to actually do tech collaboration and be able to export products that we make in Australia out of that collaboration without actually having to pay our dues to the United States, right? So what we're talking about here is taking these export control regimes that the US has built up over 70 or 80 years to protect its crown jewels. What we're trying to say to the US, hey, we're on your team, but you've got to cut us a deal here. And the deal is you've got to let us not only have access to your crown jewels, but allow us to spin off commercially, if we wish, things that we get out of that, and we can sell that to the world without being told not to do so by the United States. So that's the dilemma for how is that going to work under Trump? We don't know.
Kevin, I've got a question for you. But before I did that, do you want to respond to anything that Alan said and reflections or thoughts that came up?
No, it's a great summary.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing that Alan did say was he talked about unleashing the animal spirits of technology moguls, and all it made me think is what animal spirit would Elon Musk be? But I'm wondering, with Elon Musk being so personally and professionally close to Trump and the administration with the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, what does Elon Musk, as the owner of SpaceX, Tesla, an entrepreneur, innovator, what is he going to mean for US technology regulations? And then once you've answered that, I'm going to open it up to the audience. So can you have a think now, audience members, about what things you'd like to ask our experts?
Yeah, so to do the setup, when you asked me what Trump is going to do next, and I said, I don't know, it's very well-informed, I don't know. Because what I do for a living, I work with these thing companies that interact with the government on a regular basis. I know most of the people that store into the government in this area, and they have no idea what their orders are with respect to what to change. And they don't know because they don't know what Elon is going to instruct. I hate to say this, but it's an oligarchic kind of government that we've descended into. And personal economic interest of individuals like Musk carry great weight in what the policy is happening. What the Biden team left behind was this global regulation with significant controls over all things related to AI, very broadly defined, given that policy assessment that they are sensitive and warranting control as national security. But they created a delayed compliance date until May 15th. And so no actual change has to happen. But for China's still walled off and has been in this ecosystem since October of 2022, and that's not going to change. What really is uncertain is with respect to how liberal or not trade will be primarily with the Middle East. And the reason I focus on the Middle East is because Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are spending hundreds of billions of dollars in building data centers, buying NVIDIA GPUs, in order to create the next wave of advanced AI applications. And the US, the Biden administration really put aggressive controls regulating that, primarily for concern that they didn't want that capability to be occurring outside the United States. And so my suspicion is that when the interest of Elon Musk and others, which is to sell more to the Middle East, start factoring in, that there will be a pretty general liberalization with respect to the world on what the Biden team put in place. But we're only really just days into this, but we're going to have to find out relatively soon, as I said, because May 15th is the compliance date. And I suspect what we'll see is sort of an instruction that comes down from the new Secretary of Commerce, who just started Tuesday. So we're all very, very new here. He will say, make it simpler and come back with a different idea and extend it out sometime deeper in 2025. The conflict, this will be my last point, the really fascinating conflict in this ecosystem to watch within the Trump administration is all of the people who are coming into the government in my former position and the undersecretary positions and secretary positions are complete China hawks. They are of a worldview that nothing involving China can be trusted. All dual-use technology of every sort should be blocked from China. And they are overtly, proudly decouplers. They call themselves that there should be just a broader break with China economically, both in high tech as well as low tech for supply chain security reasons. And that's their worldview, and that will no doubt be what their positions and recommendations are. Trump individually, as I said earlier, doesn't care about any of this substantively. All he cares about is a deal, having a victory, having some grand bargain with China. What's going to be number one on China's negotiation list? Exactly this topic. And so what they all fear, and they tell me this, is that the whole of the government, state, commerce, defense, energy, all the agencies will come together and likely agree to far more aggressive packages on a wider range of technologies, cutting them off from both China directly and indirectly, and Chinese companies outside of China. And that Trump will go into a room with Xi, come out with a deal, and trade it all the way for an agreement to buy all the grain in Nebraska or something. And so when I say I don't know, it's a function of just like almost every other area of policy outside the core issues you read about in the paper, everybody, nobody really knows what he's going to do from one day to the next. And even the people that work for him assume that he's going to take a position one day and the opposite position the next day, which is why as a Democrat, it was always so hard to run against him because he would say exactly the opposite things and people don't care. So we'll basically hang on for the ride. I can tell you what the career staff are going to say, which I just said, but the big, huge variable is what he individually, and these decisions will go to his level because they're so fundamental. The other problem in terms of implementing any of these changes, I said that was the last point, I promised the last point, is that with Musk and Doge, as you've been reading, they're indiscriminately firing huge percentages of the US government, not based upon any particular position or background or qualification or job evaluation, just wholesale cuts to agencies. And even just Friday, the day before I came out here, the senior leadership of the Commerce Department, where I came from, the career staff who are the experts in these regulations that take decades to understand, they were fired, everybody. And then the National Security Council, which sort of functions by DPLEs from every other agency, they were all told to go away, and most of them were fired. And so, in addition to losing the technical expertise, the morale of U.S. government career staff is as low as it's ever been. These are all generally good career civil servants that will do exactly what they're told, but I don't know how the Trump administration is actually going to get anything done, even with all these grand ambitions, in light of the fact that until they can bring in sort of MAGA people to learn all these new rules, and which is their goal, which is to repopulate the government with Trump loyalists. It's going to be a while before the actual paperwork, the actual regulations, and can move through the system. So there's going to be sort of a pause of curiosity and uncertainty for the best part of 2025 in terms of what the final outcome is going to be, I suspect.
And this is the very concerning and challenging thing, is that people with Kevin's knowledge, they're not always existing in departments now, because if there's been mass firings of people with Kevin's type of institutional knowledge aren't there to explain the reasons why these processes actually matter. When you're talking about the regulation and control of arms transfer, yeah, it might be boring, But it's really important to follow the processes, and the processes are there for a reason. So I'm concerned about that for the next 4 years of actually what it will look like if you don't have the bureaucrats that you need with the knowledge and expertise you need.
And a complete disregard and disrespect and overt hate for regular rules process and the rule of law. So he has Trump both houses of Congress. He can get any law he wants passed, whatever it is. If he doesn't like USAID or what it's being funded, propose a bill, change the scope, change what countries are contributed to, reduce the dollar amounts. That would be the normal way of doing it. What he's been doing, agency after agency after agency, is just ordering it by fiat completely illegally, skipping the normal process and the rules, and taking control over all the independent agencies, sending the DOJ people in illegally to just randomly fire people. And they're happening so fast, it's impossible for the lawyers to keep up with bringing suits in order to stop the action. So there, if you'll first time you've ever met me, but I am as normal and moderate and institutionalist as you can get. I am not a crazy person. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm just a normal rule of law guy, about running a process and coming up with policy. And I really can't understate the amount of chaos that's going on right now in the federal government because of this completely autocratic approach and oligarchic approach to running the government. And it's insane. So
Kevin is taking a holiday at the end of this.
yeah,
He's going to the Blue Mountains, so don't worry, he's going to.
I'm assuming they'll let me back in the country after this. But
So at this point, can we open it up to questions from the room? Could you please
Wow.
keep your questions short, state your name and affiliation, and also who you'd like your question directed to. So, I mean, our motto is Analysis of America, Insights for Australia. And I think that in this case, Kevin's your Analysis of America and the Insight for Australia is Alan. So why don't we go to the back, the gentleman there, and please use the microphone because we have a large online audience as well.
It's on?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm just curious about Donald Trump's trade tariffs, particularly if you look at, say, Mexico and Canada. If he's trying to fight against this trade war between China, shouldn't he be trying to break down barriers between the closest allies, like trading partners, and then trying to make sure they don't sort of go to China instead of, it feels like he's pushing them away because he's using that China using Canada and Mexico as a platform to get things into America.
And let's take one more question as well. So that's a question on tariffs and trade. And there was a question over there. Okay, this gentleman here.
Yes, question here. My name is Ed Scaberis. I used to
Could you
do
put it-
work on
sorry, speak
innovation
into the
and
mic.
technical change for the OECD and the UN in the 70s and 80s, looking at how innovation affects competitiveness. And I'm reminded that when you're saying about Chinese stealing technology, that was exactly what the Americans used to say about the Japanese. That's why they're doing better. When actually it wasn't. The Americans had dropped the ball. The Japanese had developed a more appropriate business model, improving on manufacturability and so on. Why do you argue that it might not be the same, that the Chinese have found a more appropriate business model and the only excuse is, well, they must have stolen what we had?
yeah, so the first question is perfectly logical. Why are we attacking our friends, literally our biggest customers, if you don't, and closest allies and neighbors, and basically repeating talking points from Putin? It's insane, and I don't know. It doesn't make sense. The way I've heard Trump friends or friends of mine who are Trump supporters explain it is that take him seriously, but don't take him literally. He has personal grievances that he wants to resolve, such as an incident that he had with Trudeau. He sees the world very simply in terms of which countries are taking advantage of us, and that's translated by which countries for which there are trade deficits. He sees the world simply that there's only one tool to address that as leverage to address those personal grievances and that deficit, which is through tariffs. He doesn't believe that tariffs are ultimately borne and paid by consumers. He believes that results in greater cost to the exporter, which no actual economist believes, but that's that his worldview, and he can use the threat and the imposition of tariffs as leverage to get other unrelated things that he thinks are important done, such as either for political reasons, optics reasons, or substantive reasons. And so, for example, his two big areas in that are immigration and fentanyl. And so he's going after Mexico and Canada, even though Canada only ships, or through Canada, 0.1% of all fentanyl, nonetheless, it's the biggest issue for him, and he gets it mixed up with his personal grievances. And so that's who he is, and that's what he's doing. The Canadians have done a great job, I think, of protecting their national sovereignty as any other country would, winning a hockey game, which was very important the other night. Seriously, I think that was necessary psychologically. But at the same time, basically letting Trump have his victory, not complaining about it, and just hoping he'll move on to somebody else next. And that's sort of something to keep in mind as an Australian, to the extent, you all have a trade surplus with the US, so you may not be in Trump's sights at some point in the future. But I think keeping that psychology of this really, unique individual in mind.
And how can it also apply to the tech sector? That's what I mean. Like, now, how can you apply it to the tech industry right now, particularly looking at chips?
Yeah, so it has no impact on chips yet. What he might do is impose tariffs on not only chips, but things containing chips that are made in China, and impose them. And that would just be devastating for the US economy because of the price increases and the criticality of semiconductors and everything that exists. So I'm hoping that that doesn't happen, and cooler heads in the Trump administration will prevent the imposition of tariffs on the import of semiconductors.
Alan, would you like to tackle that second?
Yes. Okay. So just to clarify, I'm not arguing that China has closed the technology gap on the United States just by stealing everything. There's no doubt that China has stolen IP from many countries on an industrial scale. I think I'm happy to argue that. But I would say that what has happened is you've got to give China credit. They have mobilized their capital. They've had strategic objectives. They put a lot of time and effort and money into getting where they have from being, I said, a technology lightweight to almost a peer with the United States because of their own hard work. So I'll give them a tick for that. I understand what they're trying to do there. But if you look, so it's a combination of Western complacency, Chinese innovation and hard work, and also industrial level hacking, as a few other, distorting the playing field, has kind of got China where it's got. You can argue about what the balance is, but that's the way they've got here, and that's happened, right? They're not the only country that's ever done that in life. I take their point. However, the reality is, and so if I just put my policy hat on in Washington, and I'm thinking, well, China's come from here to here, and this is where we are now. If we extrapolate from what's happened in the past, then China's going to zoom past us unless we do something different. So what are we going to do different? So this is what we've been talking about, right? So that's really what I'm saying.
Questions?
Very popular.
And that gentleman at the back. And could you please state your name and your affiliation?
James Lamb, dual citizen by marriage. Is that enough? Retired. This is a previous story, but one of the things that I heard that I don't know enough about is in the Ukraine war, Elon Musk, they were using Starlink for communications, and Elon Musk, the story was Elon Musk himself decided to cut that off because he was afraid that Russia was going to start using nuclear weapons or whatever. I presume there was some coordination with the government in that regard, but that speaks to sort of the private sector versus government and sort of the size and the technology that's held within the private sector that isn't necessarily under the control of the government. And I think throughout history, there have been corporations that have played both sides for their own profit advantage. Do you have any comments about that?
Do you want to have a first go at the?
Well, I think this is more than what I've read in the same media that you've read, I suspect, with respect. He didn't want, he pulled the use of the link so that the Ukrainians couldn't use it to attack a Russian vessel, ship in the sea. And The US is largely dependent upon him for space launch capability in certain areas. And so that makes, I think, all the more acute the conflicts of interest he has of his making decisions on who gets hired and fired and how the government is spending its money when it's directly relevant to his business. But in terms of any personal knowledge of anything, I don't have anything beyond what I read. And it's just, we are in all of these discussions in a state of American history that this hasn't really occurred. You know, we had robber barons in the 1800s, the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and all that, but they weren't involved in politics. They weren't involved in making decisions about, or they weren't active in supporting political parties. They were just making lots of money. And so we're really at there isn't really a precedent for this kind of discussion. But again, it's a long way of saying I have no idea.
So I just add one thing to that. So Elon Musk has now threatened to do the same thing as part of the Trump full court press against Ukraine. Okay, so the difference is back when he threatened to cut off Ukraine the first time, right? I think the US government stepped in and said, well, that may not be a good idea. So he had to actually, he wasn't in a position to actually go against his own government, right? But now he's a unique, that's right. He's in this unbelievable position where this, you know, the guy, the biggest sort of technologist, wealthiest guy in the world is now also at the center of US policy, okay, on everything, including Ukraine. So it's unprecedented. I mean, it's hard to get your head around it. Anyway, the point I want to make is that Trump now, in terms of pressuring Zelensky to come to the table and basically sell off his poor country to Russia, he's got all these levers at his disposal, including the Musk factor, right? Because Starlink's so critical. I mean, the Ukrainian armed forces can't fight without Starlink. I mean, it's pretty crazy, but that's why it is. I mean, it controls everything. Their drones, all the sort of. So it's a critical technology for them. If they lose that, they're a goner, right?
Oh, sorry, I've got to get to the next question. The gentleman down the back's been waiting.
Dominic Cohen from the School of Education here at the University of Sydney. You spoke before about Trump being transactional and Australia pinning its hopes on the US victory. The US wins this, they become successful, but we have a transactional president who then goes, okay, we'll trade Australia for. What happens?
Yeah, so theoretically, of course, that's possible because anything is possible. For Australia, and again, no one actually knows. My gut is that things will be just fine from this perspective. One, you have a surplus, and remember, he sees words only in terms of who's taking advantage of us or not. Which one, you're not there. Two, culturally, Australia's, you know, somebody that he likes. Three, the push for AUKUS, for the submarine deal and the radical simplification and just simple removal of export controls, that all came from the right wing of the Republican Party, which are all big Trump supporters. And it was done as a way of strengthening the alliance against China, both militarily and substantively with tech transfer and joint development exercises. And that's a very powerful, I mean, it was eventually bipartisan, but it all, oddly enough, really came from the right wing of the party. So, you haven't somehow done something to personally offend him, as far as I can tell. So you don't have the Trudeau kind of impact where it becomes personal, or a Zelensky issue where there's other issues involving Russia. And so it is true in this transactional, he'll trade anything for anything to get a deal to look important. That's a completely true statement. But I don't think yet, and you all are closer to it than I am, that I've been tracking, that Australia is likely going to be in the sights of any of this sort of crazy horse trading that might happen on something. You're not Taiwan or, you know, Zelensky or anything like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I pretty much agree with that.
So I've got time for one more question. And can I invite any of the women in the room who would like to ask a question to ask a question? Yes. Sorry, could you wait to the mic? Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Kate H. Alan, this is for you. One of the things you said was it would be interesting to see how Australia candidate itself, I forgot your exact word, closer to the United States in terms of the opportunity to be involved in some of the innovation technologies. Tomorrow in Washington, D.C., Kevin Rudd is hosting a inaugural superannuation fund event where he's invited a lot of the investors to come to the United States and use Australian money to start investing in different types of technologies. Is this an example of what you're saying? Is that something that's going to help Trump perhaps love Australia more?
Yes, look, it is very much part of the Australian response. Hasn't got a lot of headlines, and the Prime Minister has been very careful not to say too much at all. But there's no doubt that that's been one of the considerations in Canberra about how can we, I don't like to use the word ingratiate, but it's something like that. How can we actually get on Trump's good side? And we've talked about, we've already got, so the US has got a trade surplus with us, so AUKUS, we've got all these things, we've got Greg Norman, we played all those cards before, but what else could we do? Now, this has got, okay, yeah. So I think the last time I looked, there's about $3.3 trillion in the US super sector, right? Something of that. That's a lot of money, even by global standards. So the Albanese government has been trying to actually deploy some of this capital nationally, and someone has latched upon the idea of, well, why don't we actually make that as part of our US card? We'll say to Trump, not only are we great guys and doing all this stuff, we got Greg Norman, but we're actually going to put some real money and invest in the United States because we think the future's in the US, right? So, and we're talking about serious amounts of money here. So I think that's going to happen. And the other benefit for Australia is, as I said, if whether you agree with this or not, if you are on the US team, you might as well go the whole way, because there's no fence sitting anymore. Like the old days, you could be kind of neutral or non-aligned or whatever. But, in the future, it's going to be extremely difficult to be non-aligned, okay? Because you're going to have to make a choice between the Chinese world or the US dominated, like it's one or the other, especially for smaller countries. So if we're going to be all in, let's see if we can get something out of this. So it's not only giving Trump something that he wants, but we could get something out of that by investing in US technology. If they're going to win the race, then we'll win too. That's the argument that would be made in Canberra, right?
I'll just make one last point. The relationship between the United States and Australia is longer and deeper than any one president. So keep that in mind for the long term, given the connection and relationships between the two countries. It will not always be like this.
It's going to be a long 4 years, but with people like Kevin coming out from the US to help us understand, it's going to be made that much easier. Kevin has travelled halfway across the world to be here tonight, and Alan has also spent his Monday night with us sharing his expertise. I want you to thank them with me. Thank you so much.